Aliens sent a distress signal and got the human fleet instead. The silence on Earth's comm relays lasted exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds before High Provost Kalen of the Valari hegemony decided it meant what he wanted it to mean. He was wrong. On the dark side of the Outer Rim dead zone, the civilian transport Cradle 4 drifted without engine light, without navigation pulse, without the faint heat signature that meant anyone aboard was comfortable. Its fuel cells had been removed, not damaged, not depleted. Removed, lifted out by Valari retrieval drones with the same clean efficiency one might use to take a battery from a child's toy, and left floating in a scatter field 200 kilometers off the transport's port bow. 8,000 settlers were inside that hull, families mostly, 3 generations of agricultural colonists bound for the outer worlds. They had 48 hours of breathable air, and the Valari Vanguard was not letting them use the radio for anything except the one broadcast Kalen had already approved. The distress signal went out on every open channel the transport's original transponder could reach. Kalen stood at the center of the Ethel Guard's command dais watching the feed. His thumb traced the gold leaf detailing on the edge of his ivory console, a slow, easy stroke, the way a man touches something he owns. The bridge crew worked around him in practiced silence. Nobody on his staff spoke unless he opened the space for it, and right now he had not. He had waited 6 years for an excuse this claim. The message he had appended to the distress loop was unencrypted. Deliberately, he wanted every listening post in the frontier rim to hear it. He wanted the words to travel inward toward the human sectors without interference, without the polite softening of diplomatic channels. He activated the wideband array himself, and he spoke in the flat, precise Valari high tongue that his translation protocols would carry into standard human speech without losing any of the edges. A species that lets its empathy dictate its trajectory is inherently evolutionary refuse. Come collect your scrap. He cut the transmission. His thumb kept moving across the gold leaf. In the nebula shadows 240 kilometers off the dead zone's eastern approach, 144 capital ships of the Valari Vanguard fleet sat cold and dark, their drive cores idled to minimum thermal output, their targeting arrays hot but passive. They had been in position for 9 days. The crews were patient by doctrine. Kalen had trained them that way. He pulled up the United Earth Directorate's file on his secondary screen. He had read it many times, but he read it again now because the waiting was always better with something to confirm. The file was not long. By hegemony standards, a species with fewer than 300 years of documented deep space activity barely warranted a full assessment. The relevant sections were 3: military capacity, psychological profile, historical conflict response. Kalen went to the psychological profile first. Deeply social bonding structure, strong herd preservation instinct, demonstrated tactical irrationality when civilian lives are threatened, 17 documented instances of command-level breakdown under civilian loss pressure. Do not mistake emotional intensity for tactical capability. He almost smiled, not quite. The Valari did not quite smile, but the expression was close. Humanity, in his studied opinion, was a species whose greatest military liability was the very thing it called its greatest strength. They cared too much about people they had never met. They would launch ships at a distress call away. A simple animal would run toward a sound in the dark, not because it was wise, but because they could not help themselves. The empathy that made them build civilizations was the same thing that would make their commanders override tactical reason and send the home fleet screaming across the dead zone toward those 8,000 settlers. Into his waiting guns. Kalen had positioned the ambush for a frontal approach. He expected human ships within 6 to 9 hours of the signal's arrival. He went back to the gold leaf. He traced the engraved border of the console's upper panel, the running vine pattern the Valari craftsmen of the 9th dynasty had standardized for flag officer equipment, a mark of institutional authority going back 2,000 years. He ran his thumb along it and waited. The part you need to hear comes next. Stay close. 6 hours passed. No human ships appeared on the dead zone's long-range sensors. Kalen's nav officer, a young functionary named Verath, quietly updated the detection grid and said nothing. The grid showed the same empty space it had shown for the last 6 hours. The eastern approach was clear. The standard human Navy corridor from the frontier rim inward was clear. The subspace relay bands carried the continued looping of Cradle 4's distress signal, and nothing else moving toward them. Kalen moved his thumb to the lower panel border, different section of vine, same easy pressure. He was not worried. The human signal had taken time to travel. The human command structure had to be notified, assessed, deliberated over. He had built that delay into his calculation. He had given himself a 12-hour window before he expected any response. He checked the secondary display and confirmed what he already knew. The Directorate's regular Space Navy, the Third Home Fleet, had not moved from its documented orbital station near the frontier relay. His long-range passive sensors could still pick up their drive heat at the edge of range, sitting exactly where they had been sitting when this operation began. They had not launched. They had not changed their orbital posture. They were, by every reading his equipment could provide, simply sitting there. He closed the psychological profile file. He did not need it. At the 22-hour mark, the Ethelgard's deep scan array logged a single transmission from inside human territory. It was not a fleet coordination signal. It was not an emergency scramble. It was a short-range administrative relay, the kind that moved between department offices, and it lasted 4 seconds before the encryption wrapped it and the signal dissolved. Verath flagged it. Kalen waved the flag away. Administrative traffic. Humanity was filing paperwork about the crisis. That told him everything he needed to know about where they were in the decision cycle. He allowed himself, very briefly, the expression that was almost a smile. 36 hours into the countdown, Kalen ate a meal at his station and reviewed the hegemony's updated star maps. His Vanguard fleet had been stationary for so long that 2 of the smaller patrol craft had run low-priority hull maintenance cycles. He approved the cycles. There was time. What he did not see, because his equipment was not built to see it, and because the Human Directorate had spent 14 years making sure it was not built to see it, was a slight and perfectly ordinary shift in the maintenance frequency of the buoy grid. The shift lasted 2 seconds. Nothing on the Ethelgard's board registered it as anything. 48 hours after the distress signal began, the life support projections on Cradle 4 crossed the threshold that Kalen had calculated would finally break the silence. He leaned forward slightly, watching the sensor feeds. This was the moment, when the counters passed the halfway point on the settler's air supply, when the math became undeniable even to a species that preferred not to do math. This was when the human fleet would come. He put his hand on the console. His thumb found the gold leaf again without him looking. He waited for the warp signatures. He waited for 17 minutes. And then Verath very quietly said, "Provost, the buoy grid." Kalen looked up. On his main display, every single automated routing node across the frontier rim sector was showing the same alert at the same moment. Not a fault signal, not a power fluctuation, a maintenance sync, the kind of sync the buoys ran every 6 months on a staggered cycle so that no 2 nodes would update simultaneously and disrupt traffic flow. Except they were all updating simultaneously. All 412 of them, at the same time, in perfect, impossible unison. Kalen's thumb went still. Verath ran the diagnostic twice before he said anything else. The second pass returned the same result, all 412 nodes, in perfect unison, holding a synchronized maintenance state they had never held before in recorded hegemony operational history. "It is a technical anomaly," Kalen said. "Log it." Verath logged it. Kalen lifted his thumb from the console and moved to his command chair. He sat down with the measured ease of a man who had made a career out of not reacting to things that did not deserve a reaction. A buoy grid behaving strangely was not a tactical problem. The buoy grid was not his grid. It was frontier infrastructure, old, patched together from 3 different hegemony maintenance cycles, outsourced to whatever contracting firms had taken the service agreements cheapest in any given decade. Technical anomalies happened in outsourced infrastructure. That was, in fact, one of the principal arguments for the hegemony's long-term plan to nationalize the frontier routing systems once the expansion was complete. He reviewed the ambush coordinates again. He thought about the settlers and their dwindling air. He waited for the warp signatures. None came. At 62 hours with the Cradle 4 life support window down to its final stretch, Kalen authorized a second contemplation review of human naval movement and found the same empty picture he had been finding for 3 days. The Third Home Fleet was still docked. The frontier patrol vessels were still on their registered routes. No emergency traffic clusters, no rapid response logistics signals, none of the pre-launch coordination noise that always preceded a major naval deployment. The United Earth Directorate appeared to be doing nothing. Verath had the professional discipline to keep his face still. The rest of the bridge crew shared the same discipline. Kalen pulled up the psychological profile again, this time not to reassure himself, but to check whether he had miscalculated the timeline. He had not. His timeline was correct. The settlers would enter critical threshold in approximately 6 hours. At that point, if humanity had any intention of launching a rescue operation, they would have to launch it now or accept that they had lost the 8,000 lives. For a species with their documented empathy architecture, accepting the loss was functionally impossible. Kalen had bet on that impossibility with the same confidence he would bet on gravity. He closed the file. He decided to wait the 6 hours. What Kalen did not know, what no one inside the Valari hegemony's intelligence apparatus had the capacity to know, because the information had been kept entirely off the networks they monitored, was that the Bureau of Logistics and Transit on Earth had begun its preparations 14 years ago, 3 years before High Provost Kalen had ever filed his first assessment of human space as a viable expansion target. The Bureau's director at the time was a woman named Yara Doss, who had retired 4 years later with a modest pension and a commendation for infrastructure reform. The commendation was real. The infrastructure reform was real. The part that did not appear in any public record was a single classified addendum, 3 paragraphs long, authorizing a program under the codename Project Sovereign Drift. Doss had handed the program to her deputy, a 40-year-old logistics administrator named Evelyn Vance, who had the specific quality Doss needed for a job like this. She was completely unexcitable. Vance had accepted the project the way she accepted all assignments, by reading the full brief, checking the numbers and asking one question. How many years? As many as it takes, Doss told her, but the boys turn over on roughly 14-year maintenance contracts. You want to be inside the full cycle before we ever need it. Vance had nodded. She had ordered a cup of coffee from the office dispenser and she had gotten to work. What Project Sovereign Drift needed, at its most basic level, was access. Not aggressive access, not the kind that required ships or soldiers or any of the diplomatic machinery that left records. It needed the mundane, unremarkable access that came from being the cheapest bidder on a service contract. The Valari hegemony's frontier hyperspace routing boys were old. They predated 3 generations of hegemony technical standards and had been maintained under a patchwork of contracts with independent trade cartels since the hegemony's finance division had decided, in their 4th expansion period, that internal maintenance crews were too costly for frontier infrastructure. The boys ran themselves on automated cycles. They needed physical servicing every 3 to 4 years, crystal calibration, thermal alignment, signal refresh. That service went to whoever tendered the lowest acceptable bid. Human engineering firms working through registered intermediate trade cartels had been tendering low bids on frontier boy service contracts for 11 years before anyone in the hegemony noticed the pattern. When someone did notice, they flagged it as an economic curiosity, humans undercutting rival cartel rates by 17%, and closed the file. The hegemony did not consider human commercial firms a security risk. Human commercial firms maintained grain transports and ore barges. The idea that they posed a strategic threat was, by the hegemony's own threat assessment doctrine, not worth the processing time. This was the blind spot. It was not aggressive, and it was not dramatic. It was the ordinary arrogance of a power that had never needed to consider what a lesser species might do with access to the maintenance hatch of an automated routing node. The answer was, replace the subatomic timing crystals. The crystals were the boys' core regulatory component, small, roughly finger-length, made of a mineral compound the hegemony called Vethstone, which processed the quantum timing signals that kept the hyperspace routing lattice synchronized. Without proper crystal calibration, the lattice drifted. With it, the lattice ran at tolerances so tight that hegemony military vessels could drop in and out of hyperspace within 3 meters of their plotted exit points. Human technicians, working in small 3-person crews on contracted maintenance schedules, had spent 11 years carefully replacing Vethstone crystals with synthetic alternatives. The synthetics were indistinguishable from the originals under any hegemony diagnostic tool in current use. They processed the quantum timing signals correctly. They kept the lattice synchronized. They did everything the real crystals did, with one addition that the hegemony's diagnostic tools were not designed to look for: a dormant quantum backdoor loop, keyed to a specific low-frequency pulse that existed nowhere in the hegemony's operational signal library. Director Vance had reviewed the crystal replacement progress on a quarterly basis for 9 years. The reports came in the form of routine maintenance contract completions filed through the trade cartel intermediaries. She had read each one at her desk over a cup of coffee, noted the updated node count in her personal log, and filed the report. 300 nodes replaced, then 350, then 390. 412. The last crystal had gone in 8 months, before Kalen lit up the outer rim dead zone with the Cradle 4 operation. On the Ethel Guard, the 6th hour passed. Kalen stood at his display and looked at the same empty approach corridor he had been looking at for 3 days. Verath said very carefully, "Provost, the settler's threshold." "I see it," Kalen said. The Cradle 4 life support reading had crossed into critical range. By his own projections, the settlers had between 9 and 12 hours of breathable air remaining. Beyond that window, rescue became recovery. He had been so certain. The certainty was still there technically. The logic of it had not changed. The profile data had not changed. The math had not changed. But the math had produced a result it was not supposed to produce, which meant either the math was wrong or the profile data was wrong, and Kalen did not build careers on the assumption that he was wrong. He considered that perhaps humanity had made a decision he had not predicted. Perhaps the Directorate had decided to let the settlers die, to refuse the emotional trap, to exercise the kind of cold calculation he had always assumed was beyond them. Perhaps the empathy architecture had broken down at the command level, overridden by someone with harder instincts. He found that possibility almost admirable. He also found it inconvenient, because the entire operation had been premised on the settlers being the lure. He called his senior tactician to the dais and began reviewing contingency approaches. The settlers were approaching non-viability. If humanity was going to move, the move was now or never. Kalen decided to give it 4 more hours and then reassess the operation's parameters. He did not notice that the Boy Grid's maintenance sync had never released. All 412 nodes were still holding the synchronized state Verath had logged 72 hours ago when it had first appeared. Maintenance syncs on the Boy Grid typically ran between 30 and 90 minutes and resolved automatically. This one had not resolved. It had held quietly for 3 days, while the Ethelgard's crew focused on the sensor corridor and the life support countdown. It was Verath who noticed. He did not say anything immediately because he was not sure what he was looking at. He ran a tertiary diagnostic on the grid status. The diagnostic confirmed what the primary boards already showed. The nodes were synchronized, holding steady, and not responding to the standard release pulse. He pulled up the maintenance history for the Frontier Boy Grid, scrolling back through 3 years of service logs. He found the service contracts. He found the contractor names, a string of trade cartel registrations, routed through intermediate firms. He went 1 layer deeper and found the subcontractor list. He read the subcontractor list for a long moment. Then he walked to the command dais and said very quietly, "Provost, I need you to look at the boy maintenance records." Kalen turned from his contingency review with the expression of a man who was doing important work and had been interrupted by something minor. He looked at the records. He looked at the subcontractor list. He looked at the synchronized grid status that had been running for 72 hours without releasing. For the first time in 3 days, his thumb did not move toward the gold leaf. The subcontractor names were human. Not human adjacent, not species-ambiguous commercial registrations of the kind that appeared in multi-cartel trading blocks. Human, United Earth Directorate commercial licensing numbers, routed through 3 intermediate firms, each of which traced back to a registered trade cartel with a clean hegemony commercial clearance and 11 years of uncontested service history. Kalen read the list twice. He looked at Verath. Verath looked back at him with the expression of a man who had just handed his superior something heavy and was waiting to see if it would be thrown. "Pull the service logs," Kalen said. "Every entry, every maintenance visit." "I have them," Verath said. "There are 412 entries. They begin 11 years ago." Kalen went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was the stillness of a man in control of his environment. This was the stillness of a man recalibrating something he had not expected to need to recalibrate. 412 entries, 1 per node, spread across 11 years of routine contracted maintenance, filed through 3 cartel intermediaries, cleared by hegemony commercial licensing without a single flag. He looked at the grid status display, 412 nodes, synchronized, unreleased for 72 hours. He looked back at the subcontractor list. "Get me the chief systems engineer," he said, "now." Kalen did not sleep during the hour it took the chief systems engineer to run her analysis. He stood at his secondary display with the maintenance logs open and read them the way he read everything methodically in order, looking for the pattern. He found the pattern immediately: 1 crew per node, 3-person teams, scheduled under standard crystal calibration entries. Every log showed identical work codes: thermal alignment, signal refresh, crystal swap. Crystal swap. He had not noticed it when it was just a maintenance code in a long list of maintenance codes. He noticed it now. Provost, the chief systems engineer, a compact woman named Tavel who had been with his crew for 9 years, stepped onto the dais with a data slate in her hand and the expression of someone carrying bad news with professional discipline. I've completed the preliminary scan. Tell me what we are looking at. The timing crystals in our Frontier Buoy network have been replaced, Tavel said. All 412. The replacements are functioning correctly. They have been functioning correctly for the entire period since installation. Quantum timing within normal parameters. Lattice synchronization nominal. There is no performance difference I can detect between the installed crystals and the original Vethstone specification. She paused. However, the installed crystals contain a secondary signal architecture that our standard diagnostic suite does not test for. I only found it because I was specifically looking for something anomalous in the crystal layer. She set the data slate down. The secondary architecture is dormant. It appears to require an external trigger pulse to activate. I have not been able to identify the trigger frequency because it does not match anything in our operational signal library. The bridge was very quiet. The synchronization event, Kalen said, 72 hours ago. Consistent with a low-frequency trigger pulse, Tavel said, yes. And the current synchronized state, what is it doing? Tavel picked the slate back up. She looked at it for a moment before answering. The crystals are currently running a low-level maintenance loop across all 412 nodes simultaneously. The loop appears to be holding the lattice in a specific configuration. I don't know what configuration yet because I don't have access to the secondary architecture's command library. Another pause. I do know that the configuration is being maintained actively. Something outside this ship is maintaining it. Kalen looked at the grid display. He thought about the 4-second administrative transmission that his nav officer had flagged 22 hours into the operation and that he had dismissed as departmental paperwork. He thought about 11 years of routine maintenance contracts, filed through clean commercial channels, approved by hegemony licensing, never flagged. He thought about the Cradle 4 settlers, their air window now in its final hours, and the complete silence from human military channels, and the Earth Navy sitting motionless at its documented orbital station, not launching, not transmitting, not moving. He finally understood the silence. It was not paralysis. It was not empathy overriding tactical sense. It was not even cold calculation of the kind he had briefly admired. It was the silence of someone who had already done everything they intended to do, years ago, and was now simply waiting for the correct moment to press a button. He turned to the communications array and opened a channel to his senior weapons officer. I want all weapon cores brought to full active status, he said. Now. The weapons officer's voice came back almost immediately. Provost, the weapon cores are a pause. They are not responding to the activation command. The silence on the bridge lasted exactly 3 seconds. Run a manual override, Kalen said. Running, longer pause. Manual override is the override pathway is locked, Provost. The system is showing a diagnostic hold. It is listed as an external maintenance command. Kalen stood very still. The drive cores, he said. Checking. The weapons officer's voice had gone flat in the specific way that voices went flat when the speaker was working very hard to stay professional. Drive cores are showing the same diagnostic hold. We have maneuvering thrusters only. All primary propulsion is locked to external maintenance command. Kalen looked at Tavel. Tavel was looking at her data slate with the expression of a person watching something she had built a hypothesis about turn out to be exactly right in the worst possible way. All ships, Kalen said. He did not need to raise his voice. His communications officer understood and opened the fleet-wide channel. All ships report weapon core status. The reports came back in under 60 seconds. 144 ships, 144 identical answers. Weapon cores locked, drive cores locked, external maintenance hold, manual override non-functional. Kalen's hand was resting on the console edge, not tracing the gold leaf, just resting there flat. He looked at the sensor display showing the Cradle 4, dark and drifting, its life support window down to hours. He looked at the empty approach corridor where human warships had never appeared. He looked at the buoy grid, holding its synchronized state with the patient steadiness of something that had been waiting a very long time to be useful. And then every tactical display on the Ethel Guard went dark at the same moment. Not flickered, not dimmed out. The emergency lighting came up, the low amber strips along the deck edges, and for 3 seconds the bridge of the most powerful ship in the Valari Vanguard fleet was lit the color of old metal and staffed by people who were not moving. Then the main screens came back. They did not display tactical overlays. They did not display sensor data or weapons status or fleet coordination grids. Every screen across the full width of the Ethel Guard's command dais showed the same image: a small, tidy office, wood-framed desk, a window behind it showing the grey sky of an overcast Earth morning, a ceramic mug on the desk corner, the kind with no logo, no marking, just white glaze and a small chip on the handle. A woman sat behind the desk. She was in her early 50s. Her hair was grey at the temples. She wore a plain dark jacket and no insignia of any kind. She was looking directly at the screen with the expression of a person who had agreed to take a meeting she did not particularly need. "High Provost Kalin," she said. Her voice was level, not cold in the dramatic sense, cold the way an accounting report was cold, the way a structural fault log was cold. "My name is Director Vance. I oversee the Bureau of Logistics and Transit for the United Earth Directorate." Kalen's thumb did not move toward the gold leaf. "You have been using our maintenance infrastructure for 11 years, Vance said. "That arrangement is now complete." She reached for the ceramic mug. She turned it slightly in her hand, not drinking from it. The small chip on the handle caught the grey morning light. "I have 3 items to discuss with you," she said. Kalen did not speak. He was aware distantly that his bridge crew was watching him. Verath at the nav station. Tavel still on the dais with her data slate. The communications officer, the weapons officer, 14 other trained professionals who had served under his command for years, and who were currently watching their provost stand motionless in front of a screen showing a middle-aged human bureaucrat in a plain jacket holding a chipped coffee mug. He made himself speak. "Director," he said. His voice was level. He was proud of that. "You are in contact with the Bureau of Logistics and Transit." "I am the Bureau of Logistics and Transit," Vance said. She set the mug back on the desk corner. She did not look at it when she set it down. She was still looking at the screen, which meant she was still looking at him. "The first item is this. You will transfer auxiliary power cells from your Vanguard stores to the Cradle 4 within the next 40 minutes, enough to restore full life support and navigation." Kalen said nothing. "The second item," Vance said, "all 144 ships in your current formation will leave their warp drives completely decoupled and remain at rest for 72 hours. No repositioning, no formation changes." She reached for the mug again. She held it without drinking. "The third item," she said, "if at any point in the next 72 hours a manual reboot is attempted on any ship's primary systems, drive cores, weapons, communications arrays, the maintenance loop currently running through the buoy lattice will execute a secondary command. The plasma lines feeding your Vanguard's forward engine blocks are currently routed through 3 junction nodes that we can access from the same backdoor architecture." She said this the way she might explain a billing procedure. "The venting radius of a primary plasma line at full pressure is substantial. The interior of a ship is not a good place to be inside that radius." She paused. "I want to be clear," she said, "that we are not asking you to accept these terms under threat of that outcome. We are telling you what the outcome will be if you decline them. Those are different things." Kalen's hand was still flat on the console. He was aware of it in the way one becomes aware of a body part when told to be still. "You have been inside our logistics network for 11 years, he said. 14, Vance said. "The first 3 years were planning." The number landed on the bridge of the Ethel Guard like something dropped from a height. Verath looked at his console. Tavel looked at her slate. Nobody said anything. "We have 412 nodes, Vance said. "We have access to the full cross-sector transit lattice that your cloaking fields and weapons matrices draw stability from. We have had this access for 8 months before this operation began." She picked up a stylus from her desk. She made a note on something out of frame. "We are not asking for your surrender. We are not asking for reparations or an acknowledgement of fault. We are asking for 40 minutes of power transfer, 72 hours of stillness, and your formal assurance that the Cradle 4 and its passengers will not be interfered with again." Kalen thought very briefly about what it would mean for a species to spend 14 years in quiet, not a species building warships in hidden shipyards, not a species developing superweapons or training special forces or constructing the kind of military infrastructure that showed up on threat assessments, a species that had spent 14 years taking maintenance contracts, filing service reports through trade cartel intermediaries, replacing timing crystals one at a time, node by node, with the patient specificity of people who had decided, very early, exactly what they were going to do and were simply waiting for the correct moment to do it. No rage, no declaration, no army. Just 14 years of paperwork, and then one 4-second administrative transmission, and then this. "What guarantees do I have," he said, "that after 72 hours you will release the lattice?" "The same guarantee you have always had from us," Vance said, "our word." The bridge was very quiet. Kalen looked at the screen. He looked at the woman behind the desk with the chipped mug and the plain jacket. and the stylus and the grey earth sky in the window behind her. He had spent his career reading opponents. He had a considerable talent for it. The Valari psychological doctrine on threat assessment was built, partly, on frameworks he had contributed to. He could identify bluffing in 17 documented ways across 6 species at ranges up to orbital distance. He did not think she was bluffing. "The auxiliary cells," he said. 40 minutes, Vance said. Kalin turned to his logistics officer and gave the order. The auxiliary cells reached Cradle 4 in 37 minutes, transferred by a small resupply drone that the Ethelgard's crew launched in complete silence. The drone crossed the distance between the Vanguard and the drifting transport, made the connection and began the transfer. On the Ethelgard's secondary display, the one screen Kalin had kept on sensor data, the Cradle 4's power readings climbed. Life support came back to full capacity. Navigation systems restarted. The transport's running lights came on, 2 pale lines along its hull, the kind of light a ship showed when it was no longer in danger. Kalin watched the running lights. He thought about the 8,000 people on that ship, families, agricultural colonists, 3 generations. He had thought about them for 4 days as a variable, as the lure, the bait, the emotional lever he was going to use to destroy whatever fleet humanity sent. He was thinking about them differently now. He was thinking about the fact that the human government, upon learning that 8,000 of its civilians were drifting in the outer rim with their fuel cells missing, and a Valari Vanguard fleet waiting for anyone who came to help, had not sent warships, had not sent anything visible, had instead, and this was the part he was still working through, had instead simply waited, because the trap had already been set 14 years ago, and all it required was someone to activate it. The running lights on Cradle 4 held steady. 20 minutes after the power transfer completed, 2 ships appeared on the long-range sensors, not warships. The Ethelgard's identification suite tagged them immediately, commercial salvage tugs, the kind used for disabled vessel recovery in civilian shipping lanes, unarmed, slow. Each one was equipped with long-reach tow cables and standard docking clamps. They came in on a direct approach, unhurried, broadcasting a standard commercial recovery signal on the open bands. They latched onto the Cradle 4 without drama. The tow cable locks engaged with a sound Kalin could not hear across the vacuum, but could see on his display as a change in the transport's drift vector, a slight correction, a straightening, and then the slow beginning of a course back toward human territory. Around them 144 Valari capital ships sat dark and still, weapons locked, drives locked, every crew watching the same thing on their passive sensors. 2 unarmed tugs, towing 8,000 people home, through the middle of the most powerful ambush fleet the hegemony had deployed to this sector in 60 years. Nobody fired a shot. Kalin put his hand on the console. His thumb found the edge of the gold leaf detailing. He did not trace it. He just rested his thumb against it and stood there while the Cradle 4 got smaller on his display. 2 months later, the High Council of the Valari hegemony convened in the assembly chamber of the old capital. The chamber was large enough to hold the senior command staff of every branch of hegemony military and administrative governance, and on this particular morning, it was full. High Provost Kalin stood at the center dais. He had prepared his report with the same methodical precision he brought to every operational assessment. He had also, for the first time in his career, asked his staff not to attend. He presented the updated star charts first. The frontier rim sectors had been redrawn. Human space, previously classified under the hegemony's standard tier system as a Class 4 developmental region, low priority, low threat, suitable for long-term absorption into the expansion agenda, was now marked in a different designation. The color on the charts was the same deep amber the hegemony cartographers used for navigational hazard zones, places where the physical conditions of space made transit inadvisable. It was the first time in hegemony history that the hazard color had been applied to a territory for reasons unrelated to physical space conditions. The council studied the charts. Nobody spoke. Kalin pulled up the operational summary. He went through it without embellishment. The Cradle 4 operation, the ambush formation, the buoy grid, the maintenance contracts, the timing crystals, the 4-second transmission, the 72-hour lockdown, the 2 salvage tugs. He reached the assessment section. He had written the assessment himself, without staff input, the week after returning from the outer rim. He had read it many times since. He read it now the same way he read it every time, which was without expression. The United Earth Directorate did not respond to the Cradle 4 incident with military force, he read. They did not respond with diplomatic protest, economic sanction, or public condemnation. They responded with a prepositioned administrative infrastructure control measure that had been in continuous quiet development for 14 years prior to the incident. He paused. We assessed their primary vulnerability to be their emotional architecture, a documented tendency toward tactical irrationality when civilian lives are threatened. This assessment was incorrect. Their emotional architecture is not a vulnerability. It is a misdirection. It occupies the attention while the actual mechanism operates elsewhere patiently for as long as the mechanism requires. He set down the document. The council chamber was very quiet. We expected them to fight like beasts, Kalen said. We expected the hot, predictable rage of a primitive culture, but they do not possess rage. He looked at the updated star charts, at the amber hazard color covering the space that humanity occupied. They possess a terrifying administrative clarity. He closed the document. The star chart stayed on the display. The amber hazard zone stayed on the charts. On the corner of the dais, the council's own note-taking terminal held a fresh notation in the formal record, added by the presiding clerk without ceremony: human territory, sovereign exclusion hazard, do not engage, do not approach, do not negotiate from a position of assumed advantage. The chamber was still. Outside the assembly chamber's upper windows, the lights of the old Capitol moved through their morning cycle unhurried. Somewhere in the outer rim, the 412 boys continued their slow rotations in the dark. The maintenance loop was still running, quiet and patient and in no hurry to stop.